In March 2006, an Australian Coast Watch aircraft spotted something unusual, drifting in the Gulf of Carpentaria, a vessel, moving with no signs of life aboard, no distress signals, and no indication of where it had come from. The ship appeared like a spectre from another time. Rust streaked down its hull like dried blood, and its deck sat empty under the harsh Australian sun. This was the MV Jianseng, an 80-metre tanker that would become one of the most perplexing maritime mysteries of the 21st century. No crew, no cargo, no explanation, just a ghost ship carrying secrets across the Arafura Sea, discovery in Australian waters. The first official sighting came from routine aerial surveillance on March 10, 2006. The Coast Watch crew initially assumed they were observing a vessel in distress. Protocol demanded investigation. What they found defied simple explanation. The ship drifted approximately 180 kilometers southwest of the Wessel Islands, moving at the mercy of currents and wind. Its engines were silent. No navigation lights flickered in the darkness. Most unsettling of all, not a single human figure appeared on deck. The vessel seemed frozen in time, abandoned yet somehow still afloat. Australian customs vessel. ACV Storm Bay received orders to intercept. As officers approached the mysterious tanker, details emerged that only deepened the puzzle. The ship's name, Jianseng, was barely visible through layers of rust and marine growth. No flag flew from its stern. No registration numbers adorned its hull. In maritime terms, this vessel didn't exist. Boarding parties prepared for the worst. Ghost ships often concealed grim discoveries, bodies, evidence of piracy, or signs of catastrophic failure. Officers donned protective gear and weapons, unsure what awaited them aboard the silent vessel. An empty vessel. The boarding team's boots echoed through empty corridors. Each compartment they entered revealed the same disturbing scene: abandonment, without explanation. Personal belongings remained in crew quarters. Clothing still hung in closets. Photographs yellowed with age sat on desks. Half-eaten meals had long since rotted in the galley. The ship's bridge told a story of sudden departure. Navigation equipment remained powered down but intact. Charts lay spread across the plotting table, though salt air and moisture had rendered them illegible. The ship's log, if one ever existed, was nowhere to be found. Every official document that might have explained the vessel's origin or destination had vanished. Below deck, investigators found large fish holds and processing equipment, suggesting the Jianseng had operated as a fishing vessel. But the holds sat empty, cleaned of any catch. The fuel tanks contained only residue, indicating the ship had drifted for an extended period. Most curious of all, the vessel showed no signs of violence, struggle, or mechanical failure that might explain its abandonment. The search for identity. Australian authorities launched a comprehensive investigation. The name Jianseng suggested Chinese origin, but queries to maritime databases worldwide returned no matches. No shipping company claimed ownership. No nation acknowledged the vessel's registration. No families reported missing crew members matching the ship's probable complement. Forensic teams scoured the vessel for clues. Paint analysis revealed multiple layers, suggesting the ship had been renamed several times throughout its life. Beneath the current markings, investigators found traces of other names, though none proved fully legible. The vessel's construction suggested it was built in the 1970s or early 1980s, but shipyard records from that era yielded no matches. The engine room provided tantalizing hints. Equipment bore manufacturing stamps from various countries: Japan, South Korea, China, painting a picture of a vessel that had traveled extensively throughout Asian waters. Maintenance logs, written in multiple languages, indicated the ship had changed hands numerous times. Yet every trail led to dead ends. Theories and speculation. The maritime community proposed numerous theories to explain the Jianseng's appearance. Each seemed plausible, yet none fully satisfied investigators. The piracy theory. Southeast Asian waters had long struggled with piracy. Perhaps the crew fell victim to raiders who took everything of value and left the vessel to drift. But this theory faltered under scrutiny. Pirates typically scuttle vessels to eliminate evidence, and the Jianseng showed no signs of violence or ransacking. The insurance fraud. Hypothesis. Some suggested the abandonment was deliberate, a scheme to collect insurance money on an aging vessel. Owners might have evacuated the crew and reported the ship lost, yet no insurance claims surfaced, and the vessel's lack of registration made such a scheme impractical. The people smuggling connection. The ship's configuration raised darker possibilities. The large holds could have concealed human cargo. Perhaps the vessel had been involved in people smuggling operations, abandoned when authorities closed in. Indonesian maritime police reported several ghost ships used in such operations, vessels deliberately stripped of identification and abandoned after delivering their human cargo. The IUU fishing explanation. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing plagued the region. Ships engaged in such activities often operated under false names and flags, disappearing when threatened with capture. The Jianseng's fish processing equipment supported this theory, though it didn't explain the crew's complete disappearance. International maritime law complications. The Jianseng's presence in Australian waters created a legal nightmare. Without registration or ownership claims, the vessel existed in juridical limbo. International maritime law struggled with such cases. Who bore responsibility for an abandoned vessel? Who paid for its disposal? What if environmental hazards emerged? Australian authorities faced mounting pressure. The ghost ship posed navigation hazards and potential environmental risks. Every day it remained afloat, increased chances of collision or grounding. Yet destroying the vessel might eliminate evidence of crimes or humanitarian disasters. Diplomatic inquiries yielded frustrating results. China denied knowledge of any vessel named Jianseng. Indonesia and Malaysia, both potential origins given the ship's location and configuration, similarly disavowed connection. The ship had become a maritime orphan, unwanted and unexplained. Environmental and safety concerns. As weeks passed, the Jianseng's condition deteriorated. Storms battered its hull. Rust ate through metal plates. Marine growth accumulated below the waterline. Coast Guard reports described an increasingly unstable vessel that threatened to break apart in heavy seas. Environmental assessments revealed contaminated bilge water and deteriorating fuel residues. Though not an immediate catastrophe, the ship represented a ticking ecological time bomb. Oil and other pollutants would eventually leak, potentially damaging the pristine waters of the Gulf of Carpentaria. The vessel also posed dangers to navigation. Fishing boats and cargo ships regularly transited the area. A collision with the darkened, drifting ghost ship could prove catastrophic. Insurance companies pressured authorities to act, fearing liability for accidents involving the abandoned vessel. The final decision. After extensive investigation yielded no ownership claims or crew information, Australian authorities reached a difficult decision. On April 21, 2006, the MV Jianseng would be destroyed. The ghost ship had become too dangerous to remain afloat, its secrets apparently destined to sink with it. Naval personnel prepared the vessel for scuttling. Explosive charges were placed at strategic points to ensure rapid sinking. Environmental teams removed remaining pollutants to minimize ecological impact. As dawn broke over the Arafura Sea, the charges detonated. The Jianseng slipped beneath the waves in minutes, taking its mysteries to a depth of approximately 2,800 meters. Observers reported an almost supernatural calm as the vessel disappeared, as if the sea itself had finally claimed what belonged to it. No debris surfaced, no oil slicks appeared. the ghost ship vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived. Unanswered questions. The destruction of the MV Jianseng closed one chapter but left countless questions unanswered. What happened to its crew? Conservative estimates suggested a vessel of its size required at least 12 people to operate. Where did they go? Why did they leave? The ship's true identity remains unknown. How many names had it carried? How many flags had it flown? The layers of paint suggested a vessel with multiple identities, a maritime chameleon changing its appearance to suit its needs. Each identity likely told a story, now lost forever. Most haunting of all was the Jianseng unique. Maritime experts estimate hundreds of vessels disappear annually, many in the vast expanses of Southeast Asian waters. How many drift unmanned and unnoticed until currents carry them to destruction on remote reefs? How many crews vanish without explanation, leaving only empty ships as testimony to their existence? The ocean keeps its secrets well. Somewhere in the deep waters off Australia's northern coast, the MV Jianseng rests in darkness, its empty corridors now home to deep-sea creatures. Perhaps that's where some mysteries belong, not solved, but submerged, reminding us that even in our interconnected age, the sea retains its ancient power to hide truth beneath its waves. The ghost ship may be gone, but the questions it raised continue to drift through maritime history, as persistent and unsettling as the vessel itself once was. On a fog-shrouded January night in 1906, the steamship Valencia carried 164 souls through the treacherous waters off Vancouver Island. Her captain, unaware that he was sailing not towards Seattle's safe harbor, but directly into what would become the Pacific Northwest's most horrifying maritime disaster. The Valencia's story begins not with her death, but with her life. A vessel built in 1882 by the William Cramp and Sons shipyard in Philadelphia, originally christened as a luxury liner meant to carry passengers in comfort along America's coasts. For 24 years, she had sailed without serious incident, a reliable workhorse of the Pacific Coast Steamship Company. Her iron hull had weathered countless storms. Her engines had driven her through tens of thousands of miles. Yet on this particular voyage, a series of seemingly minor errors would compound into catastrophe, transforming a routine journey into a nightmare that would haunt the Pacific coast for generations. The final voyage begins. Captain Oscar Marcus Johnson took command of the Valencia in San Francisco on January 20th, 1906. A veteran mariner with over 30 years at sea, Johnson knew these waters well, or believed he did. The ship's manifest recorded 108 passengers and 56 crew members, including women and children seeking passage to Seattle and Victoria. Among them were traveling salesmen, immigrants starting new lives, and families returning home after visiting relatives. The Valencia departed San Francisco's docks at 11:20 a.m., her holds filled with general cargo and her coal bunkers fully loaded. Witnesses on shore observed nothing unusual about her departure. The weather seemed fair, with only typical winter swells rolling in from the Pacific. No one suspected this would be the last time the Valencia would leave port under her own power. As the ship steamed northward, conditions began to deteriorate. By January 21st, the barometer was falling rapidly. Rain lashed the decks and visibility decreased to mere yards. Captain Johnson, following standard practice, ordered reduced speed and posted extra lookouts. The Valencia's whistle sounded every few minutes, a mournful cry swallowed by the storm. Navigation in the void. The crisis that would doom the Valencia began with a navigational error so subtle it went unnoticed for hours. Without modern positioning systems, ships of the era relied on celestial navigation, compass bearings, and dead reckoning estimating position based on speed, time, and direction. In clear weather, captains could verify their position using coastal landmarks, but the Valencia had seen neither sun nor shore for over 30 hours. Chief Officer Peterson maintained the ship's log. recording estimated positions every 4 hours. Unknown to him, the Kuroshio current had pushed the Valencia miles off course. Combined with compass deviation caused by the ship's iron hull and the storm's effect on their speed estimates, these factors created a fatal miscalculation. The officers believed they were safely offshore, parallel to Vancouver Island's west coast. In reality, they were converging with it. At 11:30 p.m. on January 22nd, Captain Johnson grew uneasy. According to his calculations, they should be approaching the entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. He ordered soundings taken measurements of water depth that might indicate proximity to shore. The leadsman found no bottom at 20 fathoms, suggesting deep water. This reading reassured Johnson, who maintained course and speed. Impact and immediate aftermath. At 11:55 p.m., the Valencia struck the rocks near Pachena Point with tremendous force. The impact threw passengers from their bunks and sent crew members sprawling across tilting decks. The ship's bottom tore open along a jagged reef, and freezing Pacific water rushed into her holds. Captain Johnson's first orders revealed his professionalism. All passengers to don life preservers and muster at their lifeboat stations. The crew responded with trained efficiency, but conditions aboard the stricken vessel deteriorated rapidly. The Valencia listed heavily to starboard, making movement across her sloping decks treacherous. Waves breaking over the ship drenched terrified passengers, while the screaming wind made communication nearly impossible. The first distress rockets arced into the darkness at 12:10 a.m. Their red glare briefly illuminated a scene of horror. The Valencia lay broadside to massive breakers, her hull grinding against rocks with each wave. Worse, the rockets revealed no sign of shore, only walls of spray and foam extending into blackness. Johnson faced an impossible decision. The ship was clearly doomed, but launching lifeboats in such conditions seemed suicidal. Waves estimated at 30 feet crashed over the Valencia's deck. Yet remaining aboard meant certain death as the vessel broke apart. He ordered the boats prepared, but held back from launching them, hoping daylight might reveal options invisible in the darkness. The lifeboats, a fatal decision. As dawn approached on January 23rd, the Valencia's situation grew desperate. The ship had settled deeper onto the rocks, and her hull showed signs of breaking apart. Passengers huddled in the saloon, praying and comforting children who cried for parents already swept overboard. At 8 a.m., with minimal improvement in conditions, Captain Johnson ordered the launch of the first lifeboat. What followed would haunt survivors forever. The boat, holding 30 people, including several women and children, capsized immediately in the surf. Witnesses watched helplessly as the occupants struggled briefly before disappearing beneath the waves. 5 more boats launched over the next hour. Each met similar fates, capsized by breakers, smashed against the Valencia's hull, or swept into rocks. Of the approximately 100 people who attempted to escape via lifeboat, only a handful reached shore alive. The sea around the wreck became littered with bodies and debris, the shore so close yet unreachable. Daylight revealed the cruel irony of the Valencia's position. She lay only 150 yards from shore, close enough that survivors could see trees and cliffs. Yet those 150 yards might as well have been miles. Between ship and shore raged a maelstrom of white water, rocks, and undertows that no swimmer could survive. On the cliffs above, would-be rescuers gathered. Alerted by the few survivors who reached shore and by indigenous peoples who spotted the wreck, parties from nearby settlements arrived with ropes and equipment. But the cliff face dropped vertically into the churning sea. No path led to the beach below, and the surf conditions made approaching by boat impossible. Attempts to establish a lifeline failed repeatedly. Rockets fired from shore with rope attached fell short or were deflected by wind. A brave crew member from the Valencia attempted to swim ashore with a line but vanished in the breakers. The rescuers on the cliffs could only watch as figures on the wreck's deck grew fewer with each passing hour. The city of Topeka's failed rescue. News of the disaster reached Victoria and Seattle by telegraph. The steamship city of Topeka, diverted from her regular route, raced toward the scene. Other vessels, including the Queen and several tugboats, also responded. But the Valencia's position made rescue nearly impossible. The city of Topeka arrived on the evening of January 23rd to find seas still running dangerously high. Captain Cousins brought his ship as close as he dared, approximately a mile from the wreck. Through telescopes, officers could see survivors clinging to the Valencia's rigging and superstructure, but approaching closer meant risking his own ship on the same rocks. Controversy would later surround the city of Topeka's actions. Some criticized Captain Cousins for excessive caution, arguing he could have moved closer. Others, including experienced mariners, defended his decision, noting that losing a second ship would only multiply the tragedy. The city of Topeka circled the area through the night, her searchlights playing over the water, finding only bodies and wreckage. The final hours. By dawn on January 24th, only a handful of survivors remained aboard the Valencia. The ship's superstructure, the only portion still above water, sheltered perhaps 30 souls. Among them was Chief Cook Sam Hancock, who would later provide one of the most detailed accounts of the disaster's final phase. These last survivors had endured over 36 hours of exposure, without food or fresh water, constantly drenched by spray. Many showed signs of severe hypothermia. Some had been driven mad by the ordeal, laughing hysterically or attempting to walk off the wreck into the sea. Others maintained discipline to the end, including several crew members who refused places in the lifeboats to give passengers better chances. At approximately 10 a.m., the Valencia's hull finally split completely. The remaining superstructure, weakened by 2 days of pounding, collapsed into the surf. The last survivors were swept into the sea. Of these final 30, only 18 would reach shore alive, pulled from the water by rescuers who had finally established positions on the beach below the cliffs. The aftermath and investigation. The final death toll stood at 136 souls, one of the worst maritime disasters in Pacific Northwest history. Only 37 survivors, all men, lived to tell the tale. Every woman and child aboard the Valencia perished, a fact that particularly horrified the public and influenced future maritime safety regulations. The official investigation began immediately, spanning both American and Canadian jurisdictions. Investigators found that Captain Johnson had relied on dead reckoning for too long without verifying position. The ship's chronometer showed slight inaccuracy, which affected celestial navigation. Weather conditions had been severe, but not unprecedented for winter sailing. More troubling were systemic failures revealed by the disaster. Life-saving stations along Vancouver Island's coast were inadequate or non-existent. The trail to Pachena Bay, which might have allowed rescuers to reach the beach, had fallen into disrepair. Communication systems failed to quickly relay the disaster's location to potential rescue vessels. The Valencia's ghostly legacy. Within months of the disaster, strange reports began emerging from the waters near Pachena Point. Fishermen claimed to see a spectral ship matching the Valencia's description, visible only in fog and storm. Others reported finding lifeboats from the Valencia in sea caves, mysteriously containing human skeletons despite the original boats being accounted for. In 1910, 4 years after the wreck, the Seattle Times reported that a lifeboat bearing the name Valencia had been found floating in excellent condition near the wreck site. Inside were 8 skeletons, sitting upright as if patiently waiting. Maritime records showed all Valencia lifeboats had been destroyed or recovered immediately after the disaster. The origin of this mysterious boat was never explained. Even more disturbing were accounts from the passenger ship City of Seattle in 1907. Multiple witnesses, including officers, reported seeing the Valencia afloat near Pachena Point, exactly where she had wrecked. They observed figures clinging to her rigging, and some claimed to hear distress whistles. When the city of Seattle investigated, they found only empty ocean. Lasting impact. The Valencia disaster catalyzed major improvements in maritime safety along the Pacific coast. The Canadian government established the West Coast Life-Saving Trail, later known as the West Coast Trail. New lighthouses were constructed, including Pachena Point Light, which began operation in 1908. Radio communications became mandatory for passenger vessels. Perhaps most significantly, the tragedy highlighted the need for international cooperation in maritime safety. The Valencia disaster contributed to discussions that would eventually lead to the first International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea following the Titanic disaster in 1912. Today, the Valencia rests in pieces along the Vancouver Island coast, her iron bones scattered among the rocks that claimed her. Divers occasionally find artifacts, a porthole here, a piece of railing there, but the Pacific has claimed most of her substance. What remains are the stories, the lessons learned, and the unsettling reports that continue to emerge from those fog-shrouded waters. On certain storm-tossed nights, when the fog rolls thick against Pachena Point and waves crash against the rocks with unusual fury, locals say you can still hear it, the mournful sound of a ship's whistle, calling through the mist for help that will never come. Whether mere wind through sea caves or something more, that sound serves as an eternal reminder of the night when 136 souls discovered that the sea's hunger is patient, calculating, and never fully satisfied. On September 26, 2002, a routine ferry journey between two Senegalese cities became the deadliest maritime disaster in African history. Yet most of the world would never hear the name MV Lajula R vessel that carried more than passengers and cargo, but the hopes and dreams of an entire region. The Lajula represented more than transportation for the people of Senegal's Casamance region. This government-owned ferry served as a vital lifeline, connecting the southern province to the capital city of Dakar, across the treacherous waters where the Gambia River meets the Atlantic Ocean. For many residents of Ziguinchor and surrounding areas, the Lajula was their only practical means of reaching Dakar without the expensive and time-consuming journey overland through Gambia. Built in Germany in 1990, the vessel measured 79 meters in length and was officially certified to carry 580 passengers. Her white hull and blue trim made her instantly recognizable to the thousands who depended on her twice-weekly service. But the Lajula carried more than her certification suggested. She carried the economic lifelines of traders, the educational aspirations of students, and the family connections that bound Senegal's scattered communities together. The final departure. September 26, 2002, began like any other departure day in Ziguinchor. Passengers arrived at the dock with their belongings, livestock, and merchandise. Street vendors sold food for the journey, children played among the waiting crowds, and families said their goodbyes. The Lajula's crew prepared for what should have been a routine 12-hour voyage to Dakar. Captain Issa Diallo commanded the vessel, an experienced mariner who had made this journey countless times. The weather reports indicated rough seas, but nothing beyond the capabilities of a well-maintained ferry. As the Lajula's engines came to life that evening, approximately 2,000 people were aboard, nearly 4 times her official capacity, though exact numbers would never be determined. The overcrowding was systematic rather than accidental. Senegalese ferries routinely carried passengers far beyond their certified limits, a practice born of economic necessity rather than regulatory oversight. Tickets were often sold without seat assignments, and many passengers traveled without tickets at all. The Lajula's crew, like crews throughout West Africa, balanced safety against the desperate need for transportation in a region with limited infrastructure. Into the storm. As the Lajula departed Ziguinchor's port at approximately 8 p.m., conditions in the Atlantic were deteriorating. The West African coast experiences volatile weather during the rainy season, with sudden storms capable of generating waves exceeding 4 meters. Weather monitoring in the region was limited, and communication between vessels and shore remained primitive by international standards. The first few hours of the journey proceeded normally. Passengers settled into whatever spaces they could find, some in cabins, others on deck. Many squeezed into corridors and storage areas. The Lajula's design included multiple decks, but the lower levels had been converted from vehicle storage to passenger accommodation, creating a complex maze of overcrowded compartments. By midnight, the weather had worsened significantly. Waves began breaking over the ferry's bow, and the vessel started rolling heavily in the increasing swells. Experienced travelers recognized the signs of a rough passage, but few were prepared for what would follow. The Lajula's stability margin, already compromised by severe overcrowding, was being tested by conditions beyond her design limits. The capsizing. At approximately 11 p.m. on September 26th, witnesses reported that the Lajula began listing heavily to one side. The exact sequence of events that followed remains disputed, but maritime investigators believe a combination of factors created the disaster. The severe, making her unstable in heavy seas. Water entering through inadequately sealed doors and hatches added weight in all the wrong places. The capsizing happened with terrifying speed. Survivors later described how the ferry suddenly rolled past her recovery point, trapping thousands of passengers in flooded compartments below deck. The vessel's lights went out almost immediately, plunging the scene into darkness. In the chaos, few passengers could find life jackets, and fewer still could navigate the ship's flooded corridors to reach the surface. Those who made it to the deck faced walls of water in the storm-tossed Atlantic. The Lajula's lifeboats, designed for a fraction of the people aboard, provided little help in such conditions. Most passengers who entered the water had no swimming experience, a tragic irony for people living near one of the world's great rivers. The rescue efforts. The first distress signals from the Lajula were confused and incomplete. Radio communications in the region operated sporadically, and the ferry's exact position was uncertain. When rescue vessels finally reached the approximate location hours later, they found an empty ocean marked only by debris and oil slicks. Spanish fishing vessels working in nearby waters were among the first to respond, pulling survivors from life rafts and floating debris. The Senegalese Navy launched rescue operations, but their resources were limited and the search area vast. As dawn broke on September 27th, the scale of the disaster became apparent: bodies floating in the waves, scattered luggage, and the haunting absence of the ferry herself. The Lajula had sunk in waters over 20 meters deep, taking most of her passengers with her. Of the estimated 2,000 people aboard, only 64 survivors were recovered. Among the dead were entire families, promising students heading to university, traders carrying their life savings, and crew members who had served the route faithfully for years. The investigation and its mysteries. Senegalese authorities launched an immediate investigation, though the inquiry faced significant obstacles. The ferry lay on the ocean floor, making detailed examination impossible with available resources. Survivor testimonies were traumatic and often contradictory. Most critically, no definitive passenger manifest existed, a common problem with West African ferry services. The investigation revealed disturbing systemic failures. The Lajula had been overloaded beyond any reasonable safety margin. Life-saving equipment was inadequate for the number of passengers regularly carried. Weather monitoring and communication systems were insufficient for safe maritime operations in the region. More troubling questions emerged about the rescue response. Why had it taken so long to locate the ferry? Were adequate resources deployed quickly enough? Some survivors reported seeing other vessels in the distance that failed to respond to distress signals. These allegations, never fully substantiated, added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating disaster. The human cost. The Lajula disaster claimed more lives than the Titanic, yet it received a fraction of the international attention. The victims represented a cross-section of Senegalese society government officials traveling to Dakar, market women carrying goods to sell, children visiting relatives, young people seeking opportunities in the capital. Among the dead was Senegal's most celebrated musician of the time, Ndongo Lo, whose loss was mourned throughout West Africa. Entire villages lost multiple residents in a single night. The economic impact extended beyond the immediate tragedy, as families lost breadwinners and the region lost its primary transportation link to the outside world. The psychological trauma extended to survivors, who faced guilt at having lived when so many perished. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress, but mental health resources in Senegal were limited. The disaster's impact rippled through communities for generations. Systemic failures and unanswered questions. The Lajula's sinking highlighted broader issues with maritime safety in West Africa. Ferry disasters were common in the region, though rarely on such a scale. Vessels routinely operated beyond capacity. Safety equipment was inadequate and regulatory oversight was minimal. Economic pressures created situations where both operators and passengers accepted risks that would be unthinkable elsewhere. International maritime safety organizations called for reforms, but implementation proved difficult in countries struggling with basic infrastructure needs. The Lajula was replaced by newer vessels with better safety equipment, but fundamental problems persisted. Ferry operators throughout the region continued to balance safety against economic survival. Perhaps most troubling was the question of preventability. Could earlier weather warnings have delayed the departure? Would proper loading procedures have kept the ferry upright? These questions haunted investigators and survivors alike, suggesting that the disaster might have been avoided with different decisions at critical moments. A legacy written in water. Today, the Lajula rests on the Atlantic floor, her hull slowly returning to the elements. Periodic attempts to raise the wreck have been abandoned due to cost and technical difficulties. She has become an underwater tomb, holding the remains of hundreds who never reached their destination. The disaster led to some improvements in West African maritime safety, though progress has been uneven. Modern ferries on the Ziguinchor-Dakar route carry GPS tracking and better safety equipment. Passenger limits are more strictly enforced, though overcrowding remains a persistent problem throughout the region. Memorial services are held annually on September 26th, honoring the victims and reminding officials of their ongoing responsibilities. But for many families, the Lajula remains an open wound. Loved ones lost without recovered bodies, dreams ended without explanation, a maritime tragedy that stole an entire generation from countless communities. The waters off the Senegalese coast continue their eternal rhythm, indifferent to human tragedy. Fishing vessels pass over the Lajula's resting place, their captains perhaps unaware of the mass grave below. On calm days, local fishermen say the water appears different over the wreck site, darker somehow, as if the ocean itself remembers what lies beneath. Whether such observations reflect reality or the human need to mark tragedy, they serve as a reminder that some disasters transcend their immediate impact, becoming part of the sea's darker legends and the collective memory of those who survive to remember. On the morning of July 24th, 1915, families dressed in their finest clothes gathered along the Chicago River, excited for a company picnic that promised to be the highlight of their summer, unaware that within minutes the steamship SS Eastland would become their tomb, claiming more lives than the Titanic in the heart of America's second-largest city. The SS Eastland represented the pinnacle of early 20th century passenger vessel design. Yet she harbored a fatal flaw that engineers and inspectors had repeatedly overlooked. Built in 1903 by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, Michigan, This 265-foot steel steamship was designed to carry passengers between Chicago and Michigan City, Indiana. Her sleek profile and 3 towering smokestacks projected an image of stability and luxury. But beneath her gleaming exterior lay engineering compromises that would prove catastrophic. The ship's design prioritized passenger capacity and speed over stability. To accommodate maximum numbers while maintaining an elegant profile, naval architects had created a vessel with an unusually high center of gravity. The Eastland's tendency to list had been noted during her early years of service, but modifications and adjustments seemed to have resolved these issues. By 1915, she was considered safe enough to carry over 2,500 passengers on excursion trips, a certification that would prove tragically optimistic. The Western Electric Excursion. Saturday, July 24, 1915, dawned clear and warm in Chicago. The Western Electric Company, one of the city's largest employers, had chartered multiple ships for their annual employee picnic at Michigan City. The Eastland, moored at the Clark Street dock between LaSalle and Wells Streets, was scheduled to be the first vessel to depart, followed by the Theodore Roosevelt and the Petoskey. The passengers gathering on the dock represented Chicago's vibrant immigrant community. Families of Czech, Slovak, Polish, and German heritage, drawn to the city by industrial jobs, saw the company picnic as a rare opportunity for leisure and celebration. Mothers carried picnic baskets, fathers held the hands of excited children, and young couples looked forward to dancing under the Michigan stars. As early as 6:30 a.m., eager passengers began boarding the Eastland. The ship's crew, experienced in handling large crowds, directed families toward the upper decks, where the views would be best. What they didn't anticipate was how the concentration of passengers on the upper levels would affect the vessel's already precarious stability. Captain Harry Pedersen, a veteran of Great Lakes shipping, watched from the pilot house as his ship filled beyond her typical load. The Western Electric charter had sold more tickets than usual, and company officials pressed for maximum accommodation. By 7:10 a.m., an estimated 2,572 passengers crowded aboard the Eastland, every available space occupied by families anticipating their day of freedom. The fatal listing. Even before departure, crew members noticed the Eastland listing slightly to port as passengers crowded the riverside of the vessel to watch other ships. This behavior was not unusual. Passenger ships regularly adjusted their ballast to compensate for uneven loading. Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson ordered water pumped from the port ballast tanks to correct the list. The correction worked initially, bringing the ship back to an even keel. But as more passengers moved about the decks, the Eastland began exhibiting increasingly unstable behavior. She would list to starboard, then port, then back again, as crowds shifted their positions. These oscillations grew more pronounced with each cycle. At 7:28 a.m., witnesses on nearby vessels and the dock observed the Eastland take a sharp list to port. Captain Pedersen immediately ordered harder starboard to use engine power to correct the roll, but the ship's response was sluggish and ineffective. The list continued to increase past the point of recovery. Capsizing in the Chicago River, what happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. In less than 5 minutes, the SS Eastland rolled completely onto her port side in just 20 feet of water at the Clark Street dock. The vessel came to rest with her starboard side exposed above the waterline, trapping hundreds of passengers in flooded compartments below. The screams of the trapped and drowning echoed through downtown Chicago as the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent. Passengers on the upper decks were thrown into the river, while those in the ship's lower levels found themselves trapped in air pockets or crushed by shifting furniture and equipment. The band, which had been playing on the upper deck, saw their instruments float away as musicians struggled to reach the surface. Office workers in nearby buildings witnessed scenes of unimaginable horror. Secretaries and clerks threw typewriters, chairs, and anything else that would float to struggling passengers in the water. The Chicago River, normally a murky brown, turned red with blood from injuries sustained during the capsizing. Heroic rescue efforts. The response to the disaster revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Ordinary citizens became heroes, diving into the Chicago River to pull survivors from the water. Tugboat captains maneuvered their vessels close to the overturned hull, using axes and crowbars to cut holes in the steel plating and create escape routes for trapped passengers. Helen Reaper, a 17-year-old Western Electric employee, found herself trapped in an air pocket within the ship's hull. For over an hour, she waited in darkness, listening to the sounds of rescue efforts above. When rescuers finally cut through the steel near her location, she became one of the last survivors pulled from the wreck. The Iroquois Theatre, site of Chicago's deadliest fire just 12 years earlier, was converted into a temporary morgue. Bodies were laid in rows on the theatre's stage, while families searched desperately for missing relatives. The Western Electric Company opened its facilities to families seeking information about employees, but the passenger manifest was incomplete, making identification efforts chaotic and heart-wrenching. The investigation and disturbing discoveries. Federal investigators arrived within days to determine the cause of the capsizing. Their findings revealed a cascade of factors that had conspired to create the disaster. The Eastland's design made her inherently unstable, particularly when carrying maximum passenger loads. Recent safety modifications, including additional lifeboats and life rafts required after the Titanic disaster, had paradoxically made the vessel more dangerous by raising her center of gravity. The investigation also revealed troubling questions about inspection procedures and regulatory oversight. The Eastland had passed her annual inspection just weeks before the disaster. Steam boiler inspections had focused on machinery rather than stability, and passenger capacity calculations had not adequately considered the ship's modified configuration. More disturbing were revelations about the company's awareness of stability problems. Former crew members testified that the Eastland had exhibited dangerous listing behavior on previous voyages. Several near-capsizing incidents had been reported, but not formally investigated. The ship's tendency to take on a list had become accepted as normal rather than recognized as a warning sign. Legal aftermath and unanswered questions. The legal proceedings that followed stretched on for years, ultimately satisfying no one. Criminal charges were brought against Captain Pedersen, Chief Engineer Erickson, and several company officials, but convictions were difficult to obtain. The complexity of the disaster's causes made assigning individual blame problematic, even when systemic failures were obvious. Civil lawsuits filed by families of the victims faced similar challenges. The steamship company and its insurers argued that the disaster was an act of God rather than the result of negligence. The Western Electric Company claimed they had simply chartered passenger space and bore no responsibility for the vessel's operation. These legal battles continued into the 1930s, with most families receiving minimal compensation. The Eastland's dark legacy. The immediate aftermath of the Eastland disaster led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations. Passenger vessel stability requirements were strengthened, inspection procedures were enhanced, and crew training standards were improved. Yet questions about the disaster's preventability continued to haunt maritime safety experts. The Eastland herself was eventually raised, refitted, and sold to the U.S. Navy. Renamed the USS Wilmette, she served as a training vessel on the Great Lakes until 1946. Her second career seemed to mock the tragedy of her civilian service. The same hull that had proven fatally unstable as a passenger ship performed reliably for decades in military service. The site of the disaster, now marked by a small memorial plaque, remains an active part of Chicago's riverfront. Modern buildings rise where families once searched for missing relatives, and tour boats navigate the same waters where 844 people perished on a summer morning over a century ago. Persistent mysteries. Despite extensive investigation, certain aspects of the Eastland disaster remain unexplained. Why did the ship's stability deteriorate so rapidly that morning? Could different decisions by the crew have prevented the capsizing? What role did passenger behavior play in the final moments before the ship rolled over? Perhaps most troubling are questions about what the company knew and when they knew it. Documents suggest that concerns about the Eastland's stability had been raised and dismissed multiple times. The line between acceptable risk and criminal negligence blurred in an era when industrial accidents were often considered inevitable costs of progress. Today, maritime engineers study the Eastland disaster as a case study in system failure. How multiple small problems can combine to create catastrophic results. The ship serves as a reminder that engineering excellence means nothing without proper oversight, realistic safety margins, and the courage to ground vessels that exhibit dangerous characteristics. On quiet mornings along the Chicago River, when mist rises from the water and traffic has not yet begun, locals sometimes report hearing echoes that seem out of place: laughter, music, the excited voices of families beginning their day of celebration. Whether these sounds represent acoustic anomalies or something more profound, they serve as a reminder that some disasters transcend their historical moment, becoming permanent features of the places where they occurred, waiting to whisper their warnings to anyone willing to listen. On the night of September 28, 1994, the MV Estonia departed Tallinn harbour on what should have been a routine overnight journey to Stockholm, carrying 989 souls who expected to wake up safely in Sweden. Yet within hours, she would become the site of the Baltic Sea's deadliest peacetime maritime disaster, taking 852 lives into the cold depths and leaving behind questions that continue to surface decades later. The Estonia represented the pinnacle of 1980s ferry design, a floating city capable of transporting passengers and vehicles across the Baltic's often treacherous waters. Built in Meyerwerft shipyard in Germany and launched in 1980 as the Viking Sally, she measured 157 meters in length and could accommodate over 2,000 passengers and crew. Her sleek white hull and distinctive funnel made her instantly recognizable to travelers who regularly crossed between the Nordic countries and the newly independent Baltic states. By September 1994, the vessel operated under Estonian ownership, serving the vital Tallinn-Stockholm route that connected Estonia to Western Europe. This maritime highway carried not just tourists and business travelers, but the hopes and dreams of a nation newly freed from Soviet control. Estonian families traveled to Sweden seeking opportunities, while Swedish visitors explored the Baltic's newest democracy. The Estonia had become a symbol of connection and freedom in a region still adjusting to post-Cold War realities. A routine departure. Tuesday evening, September 27th, began like countless others at Tallinn's passenger terminal. Cars and trucks loaded into the Estonia's vehicle decks, while foot passengers made their way to cabins and public areas. The ship's manifest would later show 803 passengers and 186 crew members, though exact numbers remain disputed due to incomplete records and last-minute boarding changes. Captain Arvo Andresen, a veteran of Baltic Sea crossings, reviewed weather reports that indicated rough conditions ahead. Autumn storms were common in the Baltic, and the Estonia was built to handle significant wave heights. The forecast called for winds reaching gale force, but nothing beyond the capabilities of a modern ferry equipped with advanced navigation and safety systems. At 7:15 p.m., the Estonia slipped her moorings and headed northwest toward the open Baltic. Passengers settled into their evening routines, some dining in the restaurants, others enjoying the ship's entertainment, many simply resting in their cabins for the overnight crossing. The vessel's motion increased as she encountered the first swells outside Tallinn Bay, but seasoned travelers expected such conditions during autumn crossings. Into the storm. By midnight on September 28th, the Estonia was battling seas significantly rougher than forecast. Waves exceeding 4 meters crashed over her bow, and the ship rolled heavily in the increasing swells. In the vehicle decks below, trucks and trailers strained against their securing chains, while passengers in lower-level cabins felt the full force of the Baltic's fury. The ship's bow visor, a massive steel structure that sealed the vehicle loading ramp, began showing signs of stress. This critical component, designed to keep seawater out of the car deck, was taking a tremendous pounding from the waves. Each time the Estonia's bow plunged into a wave trough, thousands of tons of water struck the visor with sledgehammer force. At approximately 12:55 a.m., crew members in the vehicle deck reported unusual noises from the bow area. The sounds, described as metallic banging and grinding, suggested that something was wrong with the visor's attachment points. Third Officer Andres Tamez investigated, but found it difficult to assess damage in the dark, spray-soaked conditions. Catastrophic failure. What happened next would be reconstructed through survivor testimonies, radio communications, and later underwater investigation. At around 1:15 a.m., the Estonia's bow visor suffered catastrophic failure. The massive steel structure, weakened by repeated wave impacts, tore away from the ship entirely. This exposed the vehicle ramp, a large opening in the bow that was never designed to face open ocean. Seawater immediately began flooding into the car deck through the unprotected ramp opening. The Estonia's design, optimized for carrying vehicles, featured large open spaces that allowed water to spread rapidly once it entered. Within minutes, the ship began developing a severe list to starboard as hundreds of tons of water accumulated in the lower levels. The flooding progression was relentless. As the Estonia heeled further to starboard, water poured through any opening it could find: ventilation ducts, stairwells, elevator shafts. The ship's electrical systems began failing as seawater reached critical components. Emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging much of the vessel into darkness. Desperate final hours, Captain Anderson issued a distress call at 1:22 a.m. Mayday, Mayday, Estonia, Estonia, we have blackout, complete blackout, and we have problems with survival. His voice, calm but urgent, would be one of the last coherent communications from the dying ship. The Estonia's list increased rapidly, making movement through the vessel's corridors increasingly difficult. Passengers awakened by the commotion found themselves struggling against gravity as the ship tilted beyond 30 degrees. Many were trapped in lower-level cabins as flooding sealed off escape routes. Those who reached the upper decks faced a scene from a maritime nightmare. The Estonia rolled through 90 degrees in less than an hour, her starboard side now completely underwater. Lifeboats designed to launch from an upright ship became inaccessible or useless. Passengers and crew members found themselves climbing along what had been vertical surfaces, desperately seeking ways to reach the water. The survivors' ordeal. Of the 989 people aboard the Estonia, only 137 survived the sinking and the hours that followed in the Baltic's frigid waters. Those who managed to enter the 10 degrees Celsius sea faced hypothermia, exhaustion, and the psychological trauma of watching their fellow passengers disappear beneath the waves. Surviving passengers described a surreal landscape as the ship completed her death roll. People climbed over the Estonia's hull, now horizontal in the water, while others floated in life rafts or clung to debris. The few lifeboats that successfully launched were overcrowded and difficult to manage in the rough seas. Rescue ships began arriving around 3 a.m., but the combination of darkness, high waves, and scattered survivors made rescue operations extremely challenging. The first helicopter arrivals provided dramatic footage of people clinging to the Estonia's overturned hull, waiting for rescue that came too late for most. Investigation and controversy. The official investigation, conducted by Finnish, Swedish, and Estonian authorities, concluded that the disaster resulted from the bow visor's failure in heavy seas. Investigators found design weaknesses in the visor's attachment system and criticized maintenance procedures. The ferry's conversion from cruise ship to vehicle ferry had altered her stability characteristics in ways that may have contributed to the rapid flooding. However, the investigation's findings satisfied few observers. Survivor testimonies suggested the disaster sequence might have been more complex than officially acknowledged. Some witnesses reported explosions or impacts that weren't adequately explained. Others questioned whether all relevant evidence had been considered. The Estonia's wreck, lying in 80 meters of water, became the center of ongoing controversy. Despite being declared a grave site protected from disturbance, unauthorized dives have reportedly occurred. These expeditions claim to find evidence of hull damage inconsistent with the official explanation, though such claims remain unverified and hotly disputed. Unanswered questions. Decades after the disaster, certain aspects of the Estonia tragedy continue to generate debate among maritime safety experts, survivors, and families of the victims. Why did the bow visor fail so catastrophically? Could improved design or maintenance have prevented the disaster? Were there warning signs that went unheeded? More troubling questions emerged about the rescue response. Could more lives have been saved with different procedures? Some survivors reported that rescue vessels passed them by in the darkness. Others suggested that the sequence of events during the sinking differed from official accounts. The Estonian government has commissioned additional studies, including advanced underwater surveys of the wreck. These investigations have provided new details about the vessel's final condition, but haven't definitively resolved all questions about the disaster's cause and progression. A gravesite in the Baltic. Today, the MV Estonia rests on the Baltic Sea floor, her hull gradually deteriorating in the cold, low-oxygen environment. The wreck site is protected by international agreement, designated as an underwater grave for the 852 people whose bodies were never recovered. Families from across Northern Europe visit memorials in Tallinn and Stockholm, seeking closure in a tragedy that defies simple explanation. Modern ferries operating similar routes incorporate lessons learned from the Estonia disaster. Bow visor designs have been strengthened, vehicle deck drainage improved, and emergency procedures enhanced. Yet the fundamental challenges of Baltic Sea travel remain rough weather, long rescue distances, and the unforgiving nature of cold water survival. Maritime safety investigators continue studying the Estonia case as technology advances and new analysis methods become available. Each examination reveals additional details about the disaster, yet also highlights how much remains unknown about those final hours when a routine ferry crossing became a maritime catastrophe that forever changed Baltic Sea travel. The Baltic continues its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human tragedy. But on certain stormy nights, when winds howl across the water where the Estonia made her final voyage, maritime radio operators occasionally report receiving fragmentary transmissions on emergency frequencies. Brief, unclear signals that investigations can never quite explain, as if the sea itself remembers what it has claimed and whispers its secrets to those who know how to listen. On the night of February 3, 2006, the MS Al Salam Boccaccio 98 slipped away from the Saudi port of Duba, carrying over 1,400 souls across the Red Sea toward Egypt. A routine journey that would become one of the deadliest maritime disasters in modern history, yet remain largely unknown to the world beyond those who lost everything in its dark waters. The Al Salam Boccaccio 98 represented a vital lifeline for thousands of Egyptian workers seeking employment in Saudi Arabia's booming economy. This aging ferry, built in Italy in 1970 and originally named the Boccaccio, had been converted from a cruise ship to a passenger and vehicle ferry serving the Duba-Safaga route across the Red Sea. Her white hull, weathered by decades of service, carried families reuniting after months apart, workers returning home with hard-earned wages, and pilgrims completing religious journeys. The vessel measured 117 meters in length and was officially certified to carry 1,487 passengers and crew. But like many ferries serving developing regions, the Al Salam Boccaccio 98 routinely exceeded these limits. On this February night, witnesses reported seeing passengers sleeping in corridors, on deck, and in any available space as the ship prepared for the 36-hour journey across the Red Sea to the Egyptian port of Safaga, a journey into darkness. The ferry departed Duba at approximately 7 p.m. local time, her decks crowded with passengers who had waited hours to board. Many were Egyptian migrant workers who had sold everything to seek opportunities in Saudi Arabia, now returning home with hopes of better lives for their families. Others were Saudi nationals and various Arab travelers making the economical crossing rather than flying. Captain Hassan Moro commanded the vessel, a mariner with extensive experience in Red Sea waters. The weather forecast indicated moderate conditions, with no warnings that might have delayed departure. As the Al Salam Boccaccio 98 entered the open waters of the Red Sea, passengers settled in for the long overnight journey, many unaware this would be their final voyage. The Red Sea, despite its reputation for calm conditions, can be deceptively dangerous. Strong winds can arise quickly, creating rough seas that challenge even experienced mariners. The narrow waterway, flanked by the Arabian Peninsula and the African continent, funnels weather systems that can turn placid waters into churning cauldrons within hours. The fire begins. At approximately 2 a.m. on February 4th, crew members discovered a fire in the vessel's engine room. The exact cause would never be definitively determined, but investigators later speculated that electrical faults or fuel line failures might have ignited the blaze. What began as a localized fire quickly spread through the ship's aging infrastructure, which had been modified multiple times over its decades of service. The ship's fire suppression systems, designed for the vessel's original cruise ship configuration, proved inadequate for the ferry's altered layout. Corridors that had been subdivided to create additional passenger space became fire traps. Ventilation systems, modified to accommodate higher passenger loads, spread smoke and flames throughout the ship. Captain Moro faced an immediate crisis. Standard maritime procedure required him to sound general alarm and muster passengers at lifeboat stations. However, the fire's rapid spread and the ship's severe overcrowding created chaos that made organized evacuation nearly impossible. Many passengers sleeping in lower deck areas were trapped by smoke and flames before they could reach safety. Desperate decisions. As the fire intensified, the Al Salam Boccaccio 98 began losing electrical power. Emergency lighting failed in critical areas, plunging much of the ship into darkness. The vessel's internal communication system went offline, preventing coordination between crew members working to fight the blaze and evacuate passengers. Witness accounts from survivors describe scenes of terror and confusion. Passengers awakened by smoke and heat found corridors filled with choking fumes. Families became separated in the darkness as people struggled toward what they hoped were escape routes. Many passengers, unable to locate life jackets or reaching muster stations, simply jumped into the Red Sea's warm but treacherous waters. The ship's crew attempted to fight the fire using available equipment, but the blaze had spread beyond their capabilities. Some crew members focused on launching lifeboats, while others worked to guide passengers to safety. However, the vessel's list and the rapid spread of flames made traditional evacuation procedures nearly impossible. The final plunge. At approximately 4 a.m., the Al Salam Boccaccio 98 began listing heavily as the fire compromised her structural integrity. Water, used to fight the flames, accumulated in lower compartments, adding weight that destabilized the aging vessel. The combination of fire damage, flooding, and structural failure created a cascade of disasters. The ship's final moments were witnessed by the few passengers who had managed to reach the upper decks. As the ferry rolled onto her side, hundreds of people found themselves trapped in flooded compartments below. Those in the water faced a different set of challenges: darkness, debris, fuel oil, and the daunting distance to the nearest coast. The Al Salam Boccaccio 98 sank in approximately 1,500 meters of water, taking with her over 1,000 lives. The exact death toll would never be precisely determined due to incomplete passenger manifests and unrecorded boardings, but estimates suggested that fewer than 400 people survived one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Rescue in the Red Sea. The first rescue vessels arrived approximately 2 hours after the ferry's final distress call. Egyptian Coast Guard ships, merchant vessels diverted to assist, and helicopters from both Egyptian and Saudi forces converged on the disaster site. However, the scope of the tragedy overwhelmed available rescue resources. Survivors floated in life rafts, clung to debris, or struggled to stay afloat in the warm waters of the Red Sea. Many had been injured during the evacuation, burned by fires or hurt while jumping from the sinking ferry. The psychological trauma was immediate and devastating. Survivors described watching family members disappear beneath the waves, unable to help. The rescue operation continued for days, but hope for additional survivors faded quickly. Bodies recovered from the sea told the story of the disaster. Many showed evidence of smoke inhalation, burns, or drowning. Hundreds more were never recovered, their remains settling with the ferry's wreckage on the Red Sea floor. Investigation and systemic failures. Egyptian authorities launched an immediate investigation into the disaster, though their findings would satisfy few families seeking answers. The inquiry revealed multiple safety violations and systemic problems that had contributed to the catastrophe. The ferry's safety equipment was found to be inadequate for her passenger capacity. Life rafts and lifeboats could accommodate only a fraction of the people routinely carried aboard. Fire detection and suppression systems had not been properly maintained or updated to match the vessel's modified configuration. More troubling were revelations about regulatory oversight. The Al Salam Boccaccio 98 had received safety certificates despite obvious deficiencies. Inspection procedures were cursory, focusing on documentation rather than actual vessel conditions. The ferry company's safety record showed previous incidents that should have triggered more intensive scrutiny. The human cost. The disaster's impact extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. Entire families were wiped out, leaving surviving relatives to cope with multiple deaths and economic devastation. Many victims were primary breadwinners, whose deaths plunged their families into poverty. The Egyptian migrant worker community was particularly hard hit. These men and women had risked everything to seek opportunities abroad, only to perish while returning home. Their deaths represented not just personal tragedies, but the loss of dreams and aspirations that had motivated their dangerous journeys. Villages throughout Egypt mourned multiple losses as news of the disaster spread. Memorial services were held for victims whose bodies were never recovered, while families struggled with uncertainty about their loved ones' fates. The psychological impact rippled through communities for years, affecting survivors and families alike. Regulatory changes and ongoing challenges. The Al Salam Boccaccio 98 disaster prompted calls for improved maritime safety throughout the Middle East and North Africa. New regulations were proposed for ferry operations, including stricter passenger limits, enhanced safety equipment requirements, and improved inspection procedures. However, implementation of these measures proved challenging in a region where ferry travel remains essential for millions of people. Economic pressures continued to drive overcrowding, while regulatory enforcement remained inconsistent. The fundamental tension between safety and accessibility persisted. with tragic results continuing to occur on other routes. A grave beneath the waves. Today, the MS Al Salam Boccaccio 98 rests on the Red Sea floor, her hull slowly deteriorating in the deep waters between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. The wreck site has become an underwater tomb for the hundreds of passengers whose bodies were never recovered, their remains mingling with the twisted metal of a ferry that promised safe passage but delivered only tragedy. The disaster remains largely unknown outside the region, overshadowed by other maritime tragedies that captured international attention. Yet for the families who lost everything on that February night, the Al Salam Boccaccio 98 represents one of modern history's most devastating peacetime maritime disasters. Occasionally, fishing vessels working in the Red Sea report finding debris or personal effects that may have originated from the ferry, items that serve as physical reminders of lives cut short and dreams left unfulfilled. These discoveries, whether connected to the Al Salam Boccaccio 98 or other vessels lost in these waters, underscore the Red Sea's role as both highway and graveyard for those who depend on its uncertain mercies. The warm waters that claim so many continue their eternal circulation between Africa and Arabia, carrying with them the memory of that terrible night when a routine ferry crossing became a descent into darkness that reminds us how quickly the familiar can become fatal, and how the sea keeps its own accounting of the lives entrusted to its care. When the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg and sank on April 15, 1912, she took with her not only 1,517 lives, but also the promise that her two sister ships would fulfill the White Star Line's dream of maritime supremacy. Yet the fates that awaited HMHS Britannic and RMS Olympic would prove that the ocean's appetite for the Olympic-class vessels was far from satisfied. The Olympic-class ships were conceived as the pinnacle of Edwardian engineering and luxury, three identical vessels designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic passenger trade. Built simultaneously at Harland and Wolff's Belfast shipyard, these sisters shared more than just blueprints. They inherited a design philosophy that prioritized grandeur over certain safety considerations, creating vulnerabilities that would manifest in different but equally dramatic ways across their lifespans. RMS Olympic, launched in 1910 as the eldest sister, earned the nickname Old Reliable during her 24-year career. Yet beneath this reputation for dependability lay a series of incidents that suggested the Olympic-class ships carried with them a peculiar magnetism for disaster. HMHS Britannic, originally christened Gigantic, before being hastily renamed after her sister's fate, would experience the shortest and most mysterious career of the three, sinking in circumstances that continue to puzzle maritime historians nearly a century later. The Olympic, a ship of contradictions. Olympic's story begins with what many considered an ominous sign. On September 20th, 1911, while departing Southampton on only her fifth commercial voyage, she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser specifically designed to ram and sink enemy vessels. The incident occurred in broad daylight under clear conditions, yet the cause remained disputed. The Hawke's captain claimed that Olympic had suddenly veered toward his ship, drawn by some inexplicable force. Olympic's officers insisted they had maintained a steady course. Maritime investigators eventually concluded that Olympic's massive displacement had created a suction effect that pulled the smaller warship into her side. This phenomenon, while scientifically explainable, marked the first indication that the Olympic-class ships interacted with their environment in ways that defied conventional maritime experience. The collision damaged Olympic's propeller shaft and required her return to Belfast for repairs. During this extended yard period, workers and resources were diverted from Titanic's completion, potentially contributing to the rushed final preparations that may have compromised her maiden voyage. The interconnected fates of the sister ships had begun to weave together in ways that seemed almost predetermined. Conspiracy and identity. Perhaps no theory surrounding the Olympic-class ships has generated more controversy than the insurance fraud hypothesis, which suggests that Olympic and Titanic were deliberately switched before the latter's maiden voyage. Proponents of this theory point to subtle differences in porthole arrangements, deck configurations, and other details visible in photographs of the ships. The theory emerged from Olympic's troubled early career, including the Hawke collision and subsequent mechanical problems that made her expensive to operate. According to the hypothesis, White Star Line faced financial pressure and saw an opportunity to sink the damaged Olympic while claiming insurance on the unsinkable Titanic. However, maritime historians have systematically debunked this theory through detailed analysis of construction records, survivor testimonies, and physical evidence recovered from the wreck. The ships, while nearly identical, contained enough unique features to make switching impossible without detection. Yet the persistence of these theories reflects something deeper, a sense that the Olympic-class ships were somehow cursed or marked for misfortune from their conception. Olympic's wartime transformation. When World War I erupted, Olympic underwent a transformation that revealed another facet of her mysterious character. Converted to a troop transport, she carried Allied soldiers across submarine-infested waters with remarkable success. Her civilian luxury was stripped away, replaced by military grey paint and armament that transformed the elegant liner into a formidable auxiliary cruiser. On May 12, 1918, Olympic achieved something unprecedented for a civilian vessel converted to military service. She rammed and sank a German U-boat. U-103, attempting to torpedo Olympic off the English coast, surfaced at the wrong moment and found herself in the path of the massive liner's reinforced bow. The impact split the submarine in half, sending her entire crew to the bottom. This incident marked Olympic as the only merchant vessel in history to sink an enemy warship by ramming during World War I. The transformation from luxury liner to submarine killer seemed to awaken something predatory in Olympic's nature, as if the ship had finally found her true purpose in destruction rather than transportation. The Britannic mystery. HMHS Britannic's story presents the most puzzling chapter in the Olympic-class saga. Launched in 1914, just as war engulfed Europe, she never carried a single civilian passenger. Instead, Britannic was converted to a hospital ship, painted white with green stripes and red crosses, operating under the protection of international maritime law. On November 21, 1916, while travelling through the Aegean Sea to collect wounded soldiers from Gallipoli, Britannic experienced a massive explosion near her bow. The official explanation cited a German mine, but circumstances surrounding the blast raised questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The explosion occurred at 8:12 a.m. in an area where German mines had not been previously detected. Some witnesses reported seeing a periscope shortly before the blast, suggesting a torpedo attack rather than a mine strike. More mysterious still, the explosion's location and force suggested intimate knowledge of Britannic's design vulnerabilities, knowledge that would have required access to her construction plans. The impossible sinking. Britannic had been designed with lessons learned from Titanic's loss. Her watertight bulkheads extended higher, her lifeboat capacity was increased, and her pumping systems were enhanced. Naval architects considered her virtually unsinkable, even more so than her famous sister. Yet Britannic sank in less than an hour, faster than Titanic despite her improved safety features. The ship's rapid demise puzzled investigators then, and continues to baffle maritime experts today. How could a vessel designed specifically to survive Titanic-type damage succumb so quickly to what appeared to be a single explosion? The answer may lie in decisions made during her final moments. As Britannic listed and began flooding, Her engines remained running in an attempt to beach the ship on nearby Keir Island. This decision, while potentially sound in theory, may have worsened the flooding by forcing water through compromised compartments at higher pressure. More disturbing were reports that several portholes on the ship's lower decks had been left open to provide ventilation in the Mediterranean heat. These openings, submerged as the ship listed, created additional flooding points that her designers had never anticipated. The irony was complete improvements meant to prevent another Titanic may have contributed to an even more rapid sinking. Patterns of destruction. The fates of the 3 Olympic-class ships reveal disturbing patterns that transcend coincidence. Each vessel met disaster during what should have been routine operations. Olympic during a standard departure. Titanic on a maiden voyage promoted as the safest crossing ever attempted. Britannic while engaged in humanitarian service under international protection. More intriguingly, each disaster involved fundamental misunderstandings of the ship's behavior in their environments. Olympic's collision resulted from unexpected hydrodynamic effects. Titanic struck an iceberg, partly because her size created overconfidence in her invulnerability. Britannic sank because safety improvements created new vulnerabilities that weren't recognized until it was too late. The survivor's burden. Olympic alone survived to old age. But her later years were marked by incidents that suggested the ship carried psychological scars from her sister's fates. Passengers and crew reported strange phenomena aboard the veteran liner Unexplained Sounds from empty staterooms, lifeboats swinging on their davits in calm seas, and compass deviations that occurred only when Olympic passed near her sister's grave sites. During her final years of service in the 1930s, Olympic's crew developed superstitions about certain staterooms and deck areas. Some claimed to hear voices speaking in languages that matched the nationalities of Titanic and Britannic's victims. Others reported seeing figures in hospital ship uniforms that Olympic had never worn, but that matched Britannic's final configuration. The scrapping and its secrets. When Olympic was finally scrapped in 1935, workers reported finding modifications and additions that didn't appear in any construction records. Hidden compartments contained personal effects that couldn't be traced to any passenger manifest. Some items bore dates from after Titanic's sinking, suggesting they had been placed aboard Olympic during her career, but by whom and why remained mysterious. The demolition revealed another puzzle metal fatigue patterns that suggested stresses far beyond what Olympic's documented service should have created. Metallurgists found evidence of repeated severe impacts, but Olympic's official logs recorded only routine collisions and the Hawk incident. The ship seemed to have experienced traumas that were never officially recorded. Legacy of questions. Today, more than a century after their construction, the Olympic-class ships continue to generate questions that resist easy answers. Maritime museums display artifacts from all 3 vessels, but curators report that items from the collection sometimes appear in different locations without explanation, as if the ship's restless spirits refuse to remain separated. The wrecks of Titanic and Britannic lie thousands of miles apart, one in the North Atlantic's abyssal depths, the other in the Mediterranean's azure waters. Yet both sites occasionally yield evidence that challenges official accounts of their sinking. Recent expeditions have discovered debris fields that don't match expected patterns, suggesting the ship's final moments were more complex than survivors remembered. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from modern vessels traversing the routes once sailed by the Olympic-class ships. Commercial captains, their crews, and passengers occasionally describe encounters with phantom vessels matching the sisters' profiles, visible only briefly before vanishing into fog or darkness. Whether these sightings represent tricks of light and weather or something more profound, they serve as reminders that some maritime mysteries transcend their physical destruction, becoming permanent features of the waters they once called home, waiting to reveal their secrets to those who dare to look beyond the surface of accepted history. On May 7, 1915, a German U-boat's torpedo struck the RMS Lusitania off the coast of Ireland, sinking the luxury liner in just 18 minutes and killing 1,198 passengers. Yet nearly a century later, evidence continues to surface suggesting that this tragedy, which helped propel America into World War I, may have been orchestrated by the very government that condemned it. The Lusitania represented the pinnacle of British maritime engineering and luxury, a floating palace that could cross the Atlantic in under 5 days. Built by Cunard Line in 1906, she held the coveted blue riband for the fastest transatlantic crossing and served as a symbol of British naval supremacy. Her 4 towering funnels and elegant profile made her instantly recognizable to travelers who considered her passage the safest and most luxurious way to cross the Atlantic. But the Lusitania harbored secrets beneath her opulent exterior. Constructed with British Admiralty subsidies, she was designed for potential conversion to an armed merchant cruiser during wartime. Hidden mounts for naval guns were built into her deck structure, and her cargo holds could accommodate military supplies alongside civilian luggage. These dual-purpose features would become central to the conspiracy theories that emerged from her destruction. The warning that came too late. On the morning of May 1st, 1915, as the Lusitania prepared to depart New York for Liverpool, passengers noticed an unusual advertisement in several newspapers, including the New York Herald. The Imperial German Embassy had placed a stark warning directly adjacent to Cunard Line's sailing schedule. Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Great Britain and Germany. Vessels flying the flag of Great Britain are liable to destruction. The timing of this warning has long puzzled historians. German diplomatic communications, decoded decades later, revealed no explicit order to place such advertisements. The warning appeared to originate from the German embassy in Washington, yet embassy records contain no clear authorization for the public notice. Some researchers have suggested that British intelligence, which had infiltrated German diplomatic networks, may have encouraged or even orchestrated the warning to create a paper trail that would later support claims of German barbarism. Captain William Turner, commanding the Lusitania on her final voyage, received standard Admiralty warnings about submarine activity in the Irish Sea. However, these communications contained curious omissions. Unlike previous warnings that provided specific coordinates and recommended evasive routes, the messages Turner received were unusually vague. They advised caution, but offered no concrete guidance about avoiding known U-boat positions. The Admiralty's peculiar silence. First Lord of the Admiralty. Winston Churchill's role in the Lusitania's fate has attracted intense scrutiny from historians and conspiracy theorists alike. In the days before the sinking, Churchill was engaged in heated cabinet discussions about American entry into the war. Britain's financial situation was becoming desperate, and military leaders privately acknowledged that victory was impossible without American industrial and military support. Churchill's private correspondence, released decades after the war, contained several references to the strategic value of incidents that might inflame American public opinion against Germany. In a letter to Walter Runciman, he wrote about the importance of working up steam in America and suggested that dramatic incidents involving American citizens could prove decisive in changing public sentiment. More troubling was the Admiralty's handling of naval escorts for the Lusitania. The destroyer HMS Juno had been assigned to escort the liner through the most dangerous waters off Ireland. However, on May 6th, just hours before the Lusitania entered the submarine patrol zone, Juno was mysteriously recalled to Queenstown. The official explanation cited fuel concerns, but the destroyer's logs, examined years later, showed adequate fuel reserves for the escort mission. The cargo manifest mystery. The Lusitania's official cargo manifest listed general merchandise, foodstuffs, and civilian supplies bound for wartime Britain. However, this document, preserved in British archives, contains significant gaps and alterations that suggest more sensitive materials were aboard. Line items are crossed out, weights don't match container descriptions, and several entries are classified simply as government stores. American investigators, working independently in the years following the sinking, discovered evidence that the Lusitania carried substantial quantities of military contraband. Manifests filed with U.S. Customs included 4.2 million rifle cartridges, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, and 18 cases of non-explosive fuses. These materials, while technically legal under American neutrality laws, made the ship a legitimate military target under international maritime law. The presence of munitions explained one of the most mysterious aspects of the sinking the second explosion. Survivors consistently reported two distinct blasts. The initial torpedo impact, followed seconds later by a much larger internal explosion that seemed to tear the ship apart from within. German U-boat commander Walter Schwieger, who fired the fatal torpedo, noted in his log that the second explosion far exceeded what his single torpedo could have produced. The 18-minute descent, the speed of the Lusitania's sinking defied maritime engineering expectations. Ships of her size and construction typically took hours to founder, allowing time for organized evacuation. The Titanic, struck by a massive iceberg, had remained afloat for over 2 hours. Yet the Lusitania disappeared beneath the Irish Sea in just 18 minutes, too quickly for proper launching of her lifeboats. This rapid sinking has long puzzled naval architects. A single torpedo, even striking a vital area, should not have caused such catastrophic damage to a ship of the Lusitania's size and compartmentalization. The second explosion, however, would explain the accelerated sinking if munitions stored in the cargo holds had detonated. The internal damage would have been far more severe than any external torpedo impact. Survivor testimonies collected by both British and American investigators consistently described the second blast as emanating from deep within the ship. Passengers in first-class accommodations, located furthest from the torpedo impact point, reported feeling the deck buckle beneath their feet and seeing flames shoot through ventilation shafts. These accounts suggest an explosion originating in the cargo areas where munitions would have been stored. The investigation's convenient conclusions. The official British inquiry into the Lusitania's sinking, conducted by Lord Mersey, reached conclusions that many observers found suspiciously convenient for government interests. The investigation blamed the disaster entirely on German frightfulness and dismissed suggestions that British authorities bore any responsibility for the tragedy. However, Lord Mersey's private papers, discovered in family archives decades later, revealed his deep reservations about the inquiry's findings. In correspondence with colleagues, he expressed concerns about evidence that had been withheld and witnesses who had not been called to testify. Most significantly, he noted that Admiralty officials had refused to provide crucial documents about naval intelligence and escort procedures. The inquiry's treatment of the munitions question was particularly suspect. Despite clear evidence that military supplies were aboard, investigators dismissed their significance and refused to examine how such cargo might have contributed to the sinking. Witnesses who attempted to testify about the second explosion were either not called or had their testimony struck from the record. American neutrality and hidden agendas. President Woodrow Wilson's administration faced a delicate balancing act following the Lusitania's sinking. Public outrage demanded action against Germany, but America was not yet prepared for war. Wilson's private papers reveal a complex web of diplomatic communications with British officials that suggest coordination beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Colonel Edward House, Wilson's unofficial diplomatic representative, maintained extensive correspondence with British intelligence officials during this period. These communications, classified for over 50 years, reveal that House was providing information about American public sentiment and political calculations to British officials who were actively working to manipulate American opinion toward war. The timing of various diplomatic initiatives following the Lusitania's sinking suggests careful orchestration rather than spontaneous response. Within days of the tragedy, British officials were presenting evidence of German atrocities to American journalists and politicians. Yet this material appeared to have been prepared in advance of the incident. The U-boat commander's silence. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, who commanded U-20 during the attack, maintained remarkable silence about the incident for the remainder of his life. Unlike other U-boat commanders who wrote extensively about their wartime experiences, Schwieger left no memoirs, gave no interviews, and reportedly refused to discuss the Lusitania sinking, even with fellow naval officers. Schwieger's war diary, captured by Allied forces, contained detailed entries about the torpedo attack, but included unusual omissions and alterations. Several pages covering the days immediately following the sinking had been torn out, and others showed evidence of editing that was inconsistent with standard naval record-keeping practices. More intriguingly, German naval archives contained communications between Schwieger and submarine command that suggested the U-boat commander had expected to encounter a different type of vessel. His orders apparently anticipated targeting a ship carrying military supplies, but the passenger complement of the Lusitania seemed to have surprised him. The persistent evidence. Modern investigations using advanced underwater archaeology have revealed new evidence about the Lusitania's final moments and cargo. Sonar mapping of the wreck site has identified debris patterns consistent with internal explosions originating in the ship's cargo areas. Metal analysis of recovered fragments suggests the presence of explosive materials beyond what a single torpedo would have created. Perhaps most significantly, documents continue to emerge from government archives on both sides of the Atlantic. Recently declassified British intelligence files contain references to special operations designed to influence American public opinion, while German diplomatic papers include communications suggesting awareness of British manipulation of the incident. On the evening of July 25, 1956, two modern ocean liners equipped with the latest radar technology approached each other in clear Atlantic waters off Nantucket, their officers confident in their navigation. Yet within minutes, a collision would occur that maritime investigators still cannot fully explain, leaving behind a timing mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about precision navigation at sea. The SS Andrea Doria represented Italian engineering at its finest, a floating showcase of post-war recovery and national pride. Launched in 1951, this 700-foot luxury liner could carry over 1,200 passengers across the Atlantic in unprecedented comfort. Her sleek lines and modern amenities masked sophisticated navigation equipment that included the latest radar systems, gyro compasses, and radio direction finders. On this July evening, she was completing what should have been a routine westbound crossing from Genoa to New York. Approaching from the opposite direction was the MS Stockholm, a Swedish-American line vessel known for her ice-breaking bow and reliable service between Gothenburg and New York. Smaller than the Andrea Doria, but equally modern, the Stockholm carried her own complement of navigation equipment and experienced officers. Both ships operated in one of the world's most heavily trafficked shipping lanes, where precision timing and exact positioning meant the difference between safe passage and catastrophe. The radar paradox. The fundamental mystery of the Andrea Doria collision begins with a technological paradox. Both ships possessed functioning radar equipment operated by trained officers, yet they collided in conditions that should have made such an accident impossible. Modern radar could detect vessels at distances exceeding 20 miles, providing ample time for course corrections that would ensure safe passing. The Andrea Doria's radar officer, Third Officer Eugenio Giannini, later testified that he had detected the Stockholm on his radar screen at approximately 11:00 p.m., when the ships were roughly 17 miles apart. At this distance and their combined approach speed of approximately 40 knots, the vessels had about 25 minutes to coordinate their passing maneuvers. The Stockholm's third officer, Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson, made similar observations from his ship's radar room. He detected the Andrea Doria at comparable distance and timing. Both officers followed standard protocols, plotting the approaching vessel's course and speed, while maintaining regular communication with their respective bridges. Yet something went wrong in the translation of radar information to navigation decisions. The precise timing of when each ship's officers determined the other vessel's course, speed, and closest point of approach remains disputed nearly 7 decades later. The 4-minute window. Maritime investigators focused intensively on a critical 4-minute period between 11:06 and 11:10 p.m., when both ships made course alterations that seemed to ensure collision rather than prevent it. Understanding exactly when these maneuvers occurred and why they were ordered became central to determining responsibility for the disaster. Captain Piero Calamai of the Andrea Doria testified that he ordered a port turn at approximately 11:08 p.m., intending to increase the distance between the vessels. This maneuver followed established rules of the road for vessels meeting head-on. However, radar plots reconstructed from testimony suggest that the Andrea Doria's turn may have occurred either earlier or later than Captain Calamai remembered. Third Officer Carstens Johansson aboard the Stockholm claimed he ordered a starboard turn at roughly the same time, also following standard collision avoidance procedures. But the timing of his maneuver, relative to the Andrea Doria's course change, created a convergent path that made collision inevitable. The mystery deepens when examining the physical evidence. The Stockholm's reinforced bow struck the Andrea Doria on her starboard side, penetrating nearly 40 feet into the Italian liner's hull. The angle and depth of penetration suggest that the Stockholm was turning to starboard at the moment of impact, consistent with Carstens Johansson's testimony. However, damage patterns on both ships indicate that the Andrea Doria was also in a turn, contradicting some witness accounts of her final moments. The fog factor controversy. Weather conditions on the night of July 25, 26, became another element in the timing mystery. Captain Calamai reported encountering fog banks that reduced visibility, prompting him to reduce the Andrea Doria's speed from 23 to 21.8 knots at approximately 10:30 p.m. This speed reduction, while prudent for safety, altered the ship's arrival timing at the collision point by several minutes. However, Stockholm's officers reported clear visibility throughout their approach to the collision area. Third Officer Carstens Johansson testified that he could see lights on the horizon, but identified them as belonging to a fishing fleet rather than an approaching passenger liner. The discrepancy in visibility reports has never been satisfactorily explained. Weather data from nearby ships and shore stations indicated patchy fog conditions that could have created dramatically different visibility for vessels just miles apart. If the Andrea Doria was operating in reduced visibility while the Stockholm enjoyed clear conditions, it could explain why their officers made different assumptions about the other vessel's position and intentions. Radio silence and communication breakdown. Perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the timing mystery involves the complete absence of radio communication between the two ships. International maritime protocols encouraged, though, didn't require radio contact between vessels on collision courses to coordinate passing arrangements. Both ships maintained 24-hour radio watches and possessed equipment capable of bridge-to-bridge communication. The Andrea Doria's radio officer, Raoul de Beaudéon, was on duty and monitored standard frequencies throughout the evening. The Stockholm's radio equipment was equally functional and staffed by qualified operators. Yet no record exists of any communication attempt between the vessels until after the collision occurred. This silence becomes more mysterious when considering that both ships were approaching a heavily trafficked area where radio coordination was routine. Other vessels in the vicinity maintained regular radio contact, reporting positions and intended courses to ensure safe navigation. The Andrea Doria and Stockholm, despite being on an obvious collision course, maintained complete radio silence. The chronometer question, a subtle but potentially crucial element of the timing mystery, involves the synchronization of chronometers aboard both vessels. Precise timekeeping was essential for celestial navigation and position plotting, and both ships carried multiple chronometers that were regularly checked against radio time signals. However, investigation revealed that the Andrea Doria's bridge chronometer was running approximately 2 minutes slow compared to official time. The Stockholm's navigation chronometers showed similar discrepancies, running roughly 1 minute fast. These timing errors, while seemingly minor, could have affected the precise coordination of navigation decisions during the critical approach period. When officers from both ships attempted to reconstruct the collision sequence, their testimonies showed consistent discrepancies that matched their ship's chronometer errors. Events that the Andrea Doria's officers remembered occurring at 11:08 p.m. were recorded by Stockholm's crew at 11:11 p.m. This 3-minute differential could explain why coordinated avoidance maneuvers failed to prevent collision. The missing lookouts. Standard practice required both ships to post lookouts in addition to their radar-equipped bridge watches. These human observers provided backup to electronic navigation systems and could detect lights, sounds, or other vessels that might not appear clearly on radar screens. The Andrea Doria had 2 lookouts posted forward, but their exact duties and observations during the critical approach period remain unclear. Testimony from surviving crew members was contradictory. Some claimed the lookouts spotted the Stockholm's lights and reported them to the bridge, while others insisted no such reports were made. The Stockholm's lookout arrangements were similarly ambiguous. Third Officer Carstens Johansson testified that he maintained visual watches in addition to radar monitoring, but the precise timing of when he first visually observed the approaching Andrea Doria varied in different statements he gave to investigators. The helm orders dispute, the final moments before collision, involved helm orders that both captains claimed were properly executed but produced unexpected results. Captain Calamai ordered harder port to swing the Andrea Doria's bow away from the approaching Stockholm. His helmsman confirmed receiving and executing the order, and the ship's steering gear functioned normally. However, the Andrea Doria's response to the helm order seemed delayed or sluggish compared to expectations. Maritime engineers later calculated that the ship should have begun turning immediately upon receiving the helm command, but physical evidence suggests the turn began several seconds later than normal. These lost seconds proved crucial in the final approach to collision. Similar timing questions surrounded the Stockholm's final maneuvers. Third Officer Carstens Johansson ordered starboard rudder to increase separation, but the ship's response may have occurred too late to avoid collision. The precise timing of when this order was given, received, and executed became central to determining fault in subsequent legal proceedings. The investigation's limitations. The official investigation into the Andrea Doria collision, conducted jointly by U.S. Coast Guard and Italian maritime authorities, faced unprecedented challenges in reconstructing the precise timing of events. No black box recorders existed to provide objective data about course changes, speed alterations, or helm orders. Investigators relied entirely on human testimony, ship's logs, and physical evidence from the wreckage. The investigation revealed systematic discrepancies in the timing of critical events that could not be resolved through testimony alone. Officers from both ships provided detailed accounts that were internally consistent but incompatible with accounts from the other vessel. These contradictions suggested that factors beyond human error or equipment failure had contributed to the collision. Technological blind spots. Modern analysis of 1950s radar technology has revealed limitations that weren't fully understood at the time of the collision. Radar systems of that era could display range and bearing to detected objects, but calculating the precise course and speed of approaching vessels required manual plotting and mathematical calculations that were subject to human error. The critical timing mystery may stem from these technological limitations. Both ships' radar operators correctly detected each other and attempted to plot collision avoidance courses, but the manual calculations required several minutes to complete. During those crucial minutes, both vessels continued approaching at high speed, reducing the time available for effective maneuvers. The unsolved timeline. Nearly 70 years after the collision, the exact sequence and timing of events during the Andrea Doria's final approach remains disputed. Computer simulations using modern technology have attempted to recreate the encounter, but they rely on the same contradictory testimony and incomplete data that frustrated original investigators. The timing mystery persists because it touches on fundamental questions about human perception, technological limitations, and the reliability of memory under stress. Officers from both ships provided testimony they believed to be accurate, yet their accounts cannot be reconciled into a single coherent timeline. Today, the Andrea Doria rests in 240 feet of water off Nantucket, her hull broken and scattered across the ocean floor. The Stockholm, repaired and renamed, sailed for decades more before finally being scrapped. But the 4 critical minutes that sealed their collision remain frozen in disputed memory. A reminder that even in our technological age, the precise measurement of time can become as elusive as the fog that may or may not have obscured that fatal summer night when 2 ships approached each other with perfect confidence in their navigation, only to discover that time itself might be the most unreliable witness of all. On the night of December 20th, 1987, the MV Dona Paz vanished beneath the Philippine waters, carrying what officials claimed were 4,175 souls to their deaths. Yet nearly 4 decades later, investigators, survivors, and families of the victims still cannot answer the most fundamental question about this maritime disaster. Exactly how many people died that night in what may be history's deadliest peacetime naval catastrophe? The MV Dona Paz embodied the complex realities of Philippine inter-island transportation, a vessel that served as both luxury cruise ship and overcrowded public bus of the seas. Built in Japan in 1963 as the Himayuri Maru, she was later acquired by Sulpicio Lines and renamed to honor the Virgin of Peace. At 93 meters long, the ferry was officially certified to carry 1,518 passengers plus crew, connecting the island of Leyte with Manila across the treacherous waters of the Philippine archipelago. But certification numbers bore little resemblance to reality in the Philippine ferry system of the 1980s. The Dona Paz routinely carried double, triple, or even quadruple her official capacity, packed with families returning home for Christmas, migrant workers carrying their life savings, and countless others seeking affordable passage between the country's 7,741 islands. On this December voyage, witnesses described scenes of desperate overcrowding that would prove impossible to quantify with precision. The collision and its immediate chaos. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the Dona Paz collided with the oil tanker MT Vector near Marinduque Island. The Vector, carrying 8,800 barrels of gasoline and other petroleum products, burst into flames on impact, creating an inferno that spread rapidly across both vessels. Within minutes, the sea became a burning hell, where passengers faced the choice between staying aboard a flaming ship or jumping into waters ablaze with burning fuel. The collision's violence scattered any organized record-keeping that might have existed. Passenger manifests, ticket stubs, and crew logs were consumed by flames or lost to the depths along with the ships themselves. The Dona Paz sank in approximately 2 hours, taking with her not only human lives, but any systematic record of who had been aboard when the journey began. Of the thousands who sailed that night, only 26 survivors were pulled from the burning waters. 24 passengers from the Dona Paz and 2 crew members from the Vector. Their testimonies provided the only first-hand accounts of the disaster. But trauma and chaos made their estimates of passenger numbers wildly inconsistent. Some survivors claimed the ship carried around 2,000 people, while others insisted they had seen over 4,000 passengers crammed into every available space. The impossible count. The challenge of determining the Dona Paz's true death toll begins with understanding how Philippine inter-island ferries operated in the 1980s. Official ticketing was only one of several ways passengers gained passage. Many travelers bought tickets from unofficial vendors on the docks, while others negotiated directly with crew members or simply boarded without any documentation at all. Captain Elias Olaño of the Dona Paz perished in the disaster, taking with him any definitive knowledge of how many passengers he had allowed aboard. The ship's passenger manifest, if one existed in complete form, was never recovered. Crew members who might have maintained informal counts were among the casualties, their knowledge dying with them in the burning sea. Sulpicio Lines, the ferry's operator, initially claimed 1,583 passengers were aboard based on tickets sold. However, this figure excluded children under 4 who travelled free, additional passengers who boarded at intermediate stops, and the unknown number of undocumented travellers who had gained passage through unofficial channels. Within days of the disaster, company officials acknowledged their numbers were incomplete, but by then, accurate counting had become impossible. Estimates and their contradictions. In the absence of definitive records, various organizations and investigators have proposed dramatically different death tolls for the Dona Paz disaster. The Philippine Coast Guard initially estimated 3,000 casualties, while the Department of Transportation suggested the number might reach 4,000. International maritime organizations have cited figures ranging from 4,375 to over 5,000 deaths. The wide variation in these estimates reflects not just the absence of records, but fundamental disagreements about the ferry's capacity and condition on the night of the collision. Survivors describe passengers sleeping in corridors, on stairways, and even in lifeboats. Some claimed the cargo holds had been converted to informal passenger areas, while others reported seeing families camping on the ship's deck despite the December weather. Maritime safety expert Captain Narciso Morales, who investigated the disaster for the Philippine government, later wrote that determining the exact death toll was impossible due to the complete breakdown of passenger control systems. His investigation found evidence that tickets were being sold by crew members even after official boarding had closed, but these transactions left no paper trail. The systematic failures. The mystery of the Dona Paz's true death toll exposes systematic failures in Philippine maritime regulation that made accurate passenger counting virtually impossible. Ferry operators in the 1980s faced intense pressure to maximize revenue from each voyage, leading to widespread tolerance of overcrowding that regulatory agencies seemed unable or unwilling to control. Ticket sales often continued until the moment of departure, with additional passengers boarding at intermediate stops along the route. The Dona Paz made several stops between Leyte and Manila, picking up passengers at each port. No systematic record exists of how many people boarded at these intermediate stops, as local port authorities maintained minimal documentation of inter-island ferry traffic. More troubling was the discovery that safety equipment aboard the Dona Paz had not been updated to match her actual passenger loads. The ship carried lifeboats and life jackets for her official capacity of 1,518 people, but investigators found evidence that she regularly carried 3 times that number. This discrepancy suggests that overcrowding was not only tolerated but systematically planned, with operators knowingly exceeding safety equipment availability. The economic factors. The economic realities facing Filipino families in the 1980s contributed significantly to the passenger counting problems. Many travelers could not afford official tickets and instead negotiated informal passage arrangements with crew members. Others traveled as deck passengers, paying reduced fares to sleep in open areas without assigned seating or documentation. The Christmas season exacerbated these pressures, as millions of Filipinos traveled to reunite with families scattered across the archipelago. Ferry operators, facing intense seasonal demand, allowed boarding practices that would have been unthinkable during normal periods. Witnesses described scenes at departure ports where desperate passengers offered money directly to crew members, bypassing official ticketing entirely. These informal arrangements, while providing affordable transportation for poor families, created a shadow passenger population that appeared on no official records. When the Dona Paz sank, these undocumented passengers vanished without trace, their deaths unrecorded in any official count, but mourned by families who knew they had been aboard. The investigation's limitations. The official investigation into the Dona Paz disaster faced unprecedented challenges in establishing basic facts about the tragedy. The wreck lay in deep water where recovery operations were impossible with available technology. No black boxes or electronic records existed to provide objective data about the ship's condition or passenger load. Investigators relied primarily on survivor testimony, but the 26 survivors represented less than 1% of those aboard, and their accounts were necessarily limited by their positions on the ship and the traumatic circumstances of their escape. Most survivors came from upper deck areas where they had better chances of reaching lifeboats or jumping clear of the flames, providing little information about conditions in lower decks where many passengers likely perished. The investigation also revealed that pre-collision safety inspections of the Dona Paz had been cursory and potentially falsified. Documents suggesting the ship had passed recent safety inspections could not be verified, and some appeared to have been backdated or forged. Without reliable baseline data about the ship's condition and capacity, investigators found it impossible to establish how many people she could realistically have carried. The family's endless wait. Perhaps the most human aspect of the death toll mystery involves the thousands of families who reported missing relatives, but could never confirm whether their loved ones had been aboard the Dona Paz. Without passenger manifests or systematic records, families faced an agonizing uncertainty about the fate of missing family members. Some families knew their relatives had planned to take the Dona Paz, but couldn't confirm they had actually boarded. Others discovered that family members had changed travel plans at the last minute, leaving relatives uncertain whether their loved ones had been among the casualties or had simply traveled on different vessels. The absence of bodies for most victims compounded these difficulties. With over 4,000 people presumed drowned and only a few hundred bodies recovered, families could not rely on physical evidence to confirm their losses. Insurance claims, survivor benefits, and even memorial services became complicated by the inability to prove definitively that specific individuals had died in the disaster. Modern reassessments. Recent attempts to establish a more accurate death toll have utilized computer modeling, demographic analysis, and comparison with similar disasters to estimate the Dona Paz's likely passenger load. Maritime researchers have analyzed the ferry's physical capacity, seasonal travel patterns, and economic factors that influence passenger numbers during the Christmas season. These studies generally support estimates at the higher end of the range, suggesting that 5,000 or more people may have died in the disaster. Computer models based on the ship's dimensions and typical overcrowding patterns indicate she could have physically accommodated such numbers, albeit in conditions that violated every safety regulation. However, these modern assessments remain speculative, unable to overcome the fundamental absence of records from the night of the disaster. The true death toll remains trapped in the same evidentiary void that has frustrated investigators for nearly 4 decades. The enduring mystery. Today, the MV Dona Paz rests in the deep waters off Marinduque, her hull slowly deteriorating in the Philippine Trench. The exact location of the wreck remains unknown, as do the identities of most of those who died with her. In Filipino communities around the world, families still light candles each December 20th For relatives who may or may not have perished in one of history's deadliest maritime disasters, the mystery of the true death toll persists not because the evidence is complex or contradictory, but because it never existed at all. In a transportation system that prioritized accessibility over accountability, thousands of people disappeared into a documentary void that no amount of investigation can illuminate. Their deaths serve as a reminder that in our interconnected world, the most basic questions about human tragedy can remain forever unanswered, not because the truth is hidden, but because it was never recorded in the first place, leaving the sea to keep the final tally of lives it claimed on one terrible December night when the difference between 4,005,000 souls became another mystery that the depths refused to surrender.